So we are continuing on our journey through the history of ancient Greece, where we will in this video further delve into Greece through its origins seen through that of the Bronze Age, thus beginning its humble nascent stage, so to speak. Or to make the analogy here of ancient Greece developing from that of a fetus through its initialization in the Bronze Age, which I quite like myself. It is after all here that we see the development of the first advanced civilizations seen through the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, who will showcase a distinct Greek cultural sphere, where these civilizational entities will lay down the rocks in terms of cultural and technological foundations, for what will later evolve into what we typically associate with that of classical Greek culture. Also, I suggest here, if you have not done so already, I recommend watching my Introduction to Ancient Greek History video, where I gave a loose setup of ancient Greek and its history, briefly introducing the civilizational players along with a discussion on the exciting archaeological find relating to the Palace of Nestor, the best preserved Bronze Age palace on the Greek mainland, so something to check out. Anyways, getting back to this video, let's start off with giving a brief overview of the different historical stages of ancient Greek history with some brief comments. This is a nice thing to do in my opinion, as having this in place really helps with the understanding of Greek history, as it allows us to place events, as well as keep track of continuity. History is, in my opinion, much easier to get a handle on if you view it as a large linear narration unfolding. And yeah, I really want to make a video in the future of this series where we go through essentially a mind map placing the most important historical events in ancient Greek history, which will hopefully aid in getting a stronger sense of cohesion, I hope. So let's start off with the first period set in ancient Greek, in the Bronze Age, which we may further divide roughly into three periods. The early Bronze Age from 3000 to 2000 BC, the Middle Bronze Age from 2000 to 1600 BC, and the Late Bronze Age, or alternatively what is known as the Mycenaean period from 1600 to 1100 BC. For simplicity, we can also easily remember ancient Greece in this history, or what is also referred to as the Aegean Bronze Age, as taking place roughly between 3000 to 1000 BC, so that's an easy time frame to remember. Now, obviously, going this far back in time, there is more of a lack of historical record, such as written or other archaeological records, to be found, and this does not improve when we consider the next phase of ancient Greek history, namely the Greek Dark Ages ranging from 1100 to 750 BC, which immediately follows from the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization around 1100 BC, bringing us into the Greek Dark Ages. And it should be known here that this was really a Dark Ages in terms of the whole of the Bronze Age, and it's quite fascinating. Anyways, here the historical record is naturally very limited due to collapsing populations, as well as limiting outputs in terms of the material culture around this given time frame. After the Greek Dark Ages, we head on over to the Archaic period, ranging between 750 to 480 BC, which is usually overshadowed by its big brother, the Classical period of ancient Greece, also known as the Golden Age of Greece. However, let's remember that much of what we associate with this later golden period, if you will, such as the birth of democracy and the formalization of city-states, becomes established and somewhat more formalized during this period. We see, for example, the formation of early polis, which may be translated to, not perfectly, but as a form of city-state, taking place around this period. However, these are not the same autonomous independent structures as we typically associate with classical Greece that would appear later on. The importance of this period may thus be explained as, to quote, "The civilization of classical Greece may be more striking and better known, and hence attract greater attention, yet it cannot be conceived without the period which preceded it." I'll very briefly mention here also that there exists a surprising dichotomy that takes place in the region of Chios during this historical phase, where we observe both the first signs of the purchase of slavery happening in Chios, as well as the place giving rise to the first signs of democratic development seen in ancient Greece. Anyways, we will expand upon this interesting tidbit in a later video. It is, after all, quite ironical that you see both the early signs of democracy taking place, as well as the establishment of slave trade, which do have a connection, so we will explore that in a later video. After the Archaic period, we see what is arguably the most famous period as that of the Classical period, arising from 480 to 323 BC, where there's a major flourishing of fields such as mathematics, philosophy, politics, along with famous events such as the Peloponnesian War and the leadership of Pericles, among others. This period is usually taken to end with the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC. Okay, following the Classical period, we witness the Hellenistic period from 323 to 31 BC, in which ancient Greece becomes more cosmopolitan in many ways, with its further development of cultural centers, as well as further developing fields such as the arts, philosophy, and early advancements in ancient science. This period ends with the Roman empires entering into the famous naval battle of Actium in 31 BC, where we see the culmination of the struggle between Octavian, who would later become Emperor Augustus, and Mark Antony taking place. Thus, this battle, which took place off the western coast of Greece, further exemplifies the power consolidation of Rome as an empire, and the undermining of Greek rule and further Greek kingdoms, which had really started much earlier with the pivotal defeat of Greece, with the Battle of Corinth taking place in 146 BC, where Greece essentially obtained the status of a Roman province of Achaia. The last period we may describe here, and a natural stopping place in many ways, involves Roman Greece from 31 BC to 320 AC, where Greece becomes a part of the Roman Empire. The Romans, who developed from an ambitious city-state, obviously took a great deal of inspiration from the Greeks, and it may be surprising to some perhaps to learn that Greek culture continued to thrive in many ways during this period, despite the fact that the Greeks were now under the Romans. In fact, one may say that there occurred a further blending of elements of Greek and Roman cultural tapestries during this time period, along with both artistic as well as scientific innovations. The end phase of this period is often conjoined with the establishment of Byzantium by Emperor Constantine, which establishes the capital of the Roman Empire in 330 AD. This period therefore in many ways relates the Roman Empire entering into a new phase of the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantine period, which was distinct both from the previous earlier Roman Empire as well as that of ancient Greece. Alright, with that brief overview done away with, I guess we should here make a brief introduction to the Bronze Age taken as a whole, before heading over to further discuss the Ancient Bronze Age in more detail. Historians who specialize in this period will usually say something to the effect of this period getting its name arising to the incredible importance of the material of bronze, which was an alloy composed of copper and tin. This material, which was an amazing historical breakthrough in many ways, being both harder than copper and tin alone, as well as having a greater durability in terms of corrosion than its constituent parts. It is quite striking, for example, how well Bronze Age weapons, as those you see in the pictures in front of you, hold up to modern times when you study, for instance, the later counterpart of iron weapons, which obviously do not hold up as well due to corrosion. Two other features which we should mention here is that bronze is very easy to cast, having a lower melting point than copper, as well as when you make tools from this material, it can be sharpened to a finer edge than those made from copper, as well as the edge being able to hold for more of an extended time. It is important to point out here that although we see a large proliferation of bronze spreading its way through the world in this period, we also have cultures experimenting with iron during this same period. We may here reference some cultures around Anatolia, which is located in modern-day Turkey, such as the Hittites, who experimented with the smelting of iron, although this material was more brittle than later iterations of iron experimentations derived from later periods. We also have cultures such as the Egyptians, Mesopotamians, and the Mycenaeans, who we will reference a lot going forward, who used iron mainly for decorative purposes, and not for the manufacture of weapons or other practical tools in general. In addition to early experimentations of the smelting of iron, there was also in existence meteoric iron, derived from meteorites which could be obtained without the smelting process, and which was used for decoration, rituals, as well as weapons such as daggers, among others. It should be noted here, however, that such a form of iron was rare to find in the ancient world, and therefore also highly valued. As an example, we may cite the meteoric dagger which was found together with the tomb of the famous child pharaoh of Tutankhamun, along with other highly valued possessions. Thus, it might be valuable to ask here why bronze was the preferred material to work with during this period. Obviously, making the comparison with iron, we will reiterate that iron in the form of meteoric iron was hard to come by, and that the process of smelting iron had not been sufficiently developed during the Bronze Age in order for it to replace bronze as a material. Iron requires in general much higher temperatures than the smelting of copper and tin, as well as the fact that the furnace required for this job was in general of a more advanced nature than the furnace design which was abundant during the Bronze Age. Interestingly, there was also strong cultural reasons for maintaining bronze, which was seen as a strong signifier of wealth and material abundance. Also, there were economic reasons, where there developed an infrastructure around bronze for which the supply of both copper and tin remained relatively stable during this period, and thus was beneficial for both trade and development. We may conjecture here that the production of iron could have happened earlier if it were not for the collapse of the Bronze Age taking place, as we will explore in a future video. It is natural to assume that under these circumstances there would have been more incremental advances as well as an increased learning curve in the production of iron. After all, we can certainly understand the appeal of iron, which it came to have in the Iron Age, as it possesses a greater hardness to be used militarily, is more abundant in the crust of the earth, as well as being more cost-effective to use. We should also not forget here that the further development of iron would also lead to the production of steel, a superior material for a host of reasons, including a greater resistance to corrosion, as well as material hardness. Steel was eventually developed by adding carbon to iron, which of course, at our present age, is increasingly abundant and incredibly important as a material. In summary then, we may state the importance of bronze during this period, which after all reflects the naming of the whole period, so obviously it's going to have a strong importance. So, we may state that, for instance, in regards to bronze, number one, there was an increased hardness, greater edge retention, as well as a higher corrosion resistance as compared with other materials used in this period. This made the material a first choice in many ways when it came to both the production of weapons, armor, along with other tools, such as the use of bronze for chariot fittings, where the construction of chariots were instrumental in the waging of war. In fact, the production of chariots served as one of the main technological advances that would allow for the Indo-European migration throughout Eurasia. Among its users, this included the Egyptians, Mesopotamians, as well as the Mycenaeans. We should also mention here another extremely important weapon during the Bronze Age, which was the composite bow, which was valued as highly advanced and an efficient weapon. But I won't go into further details here about this weapon. Perhaps in the future we can go in more details regarding this weapon. Number 2, practically speaking, bronze was relatively easy to cast, where even the production of fine detail became a realistic possibility in its production process. This naturally meant that there existed a great diversity in terms of the tools and other products which one could cast during this period. As an illustration of this, let's have a look at some pictures to see some diversity of the tools being used in the Bronze Age. They're quite magnificent. Number 3, there was a facilitation and development of trade due to the proliferation of bronze as a material during this period. Copper as well as tin were often found distant to each other, where there thus developed trade networks to ensure the trading of these goods. In addition to the economic exchange, there would also have been the exchange of technological developments in relation to the production of bronze, allowing in essence for new ideas to be brought to the table in terms of innovation and design, leading to further developments. Number 4, there was increased cultural as well as artistic importance tied with the bronze production. Sculptures, ornaments, and ritual objects were obviously important in terms of creating a sense of social cohesion within a society, where the use of bronze helped individuate localized individuals, as well as providing a demarcation in terms of wealth, opulence, and helping in the reinforcement of religions, especially in terms of rituals. Number 5, there was major infrastructure development due to bronze, which allowed for the expansion of cities and greater urbanization in general. Due to the value of the commodity, we may also argue here that the partaking of trade by cities in terms of this resource allowed cities to become more wealthy and in turn more dominant when compared with other neighboring regions, city-states, etc. As a classic example, we see for instance the rise of powerful civilizations such as the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, as well as the civilizations in the Aegean world during this period. Now, having taken a cursory glance at the importance of bronze as a material, we next move on to describe some major events taking place during this period. This is to get a better feel for some of the surrounding events taking place around the Aegean world, which will then hopefully provide some context when we finally dig into this topic of the Bronze Age in the Aegean world in the next section. We could here pretend for a minute that we take on the role of a historian working within the specialty field of the Bronze Age, and we wish to elaborate the importance of this era for a general audience. Most of all, perhaps we want to impress the view that this age is so much more important than other epochs, just as the Iron Age, which incidentally occurs in the academic fields all the time where one likes to extrapolate upon one's own specialized field. Human ego, it seems, always makes its way through. Anyways, what we could mention here could be taken to relate to events such as really the birth of civilization in many ways, such as seen in Mesopotamia during this period, where we get the rise of urban structures such as Uruk and Ur, representing the first cities which were established by the Sumerians. Although there exists a historical record of Mesopotamia dating all the way back to 8000 BC, we might argue here that a full-blown civilization really gets going around 3000 BC, where we get substantial urbanization, rise of cities, economic specialization, complex political forms, as well as one of the first forms of writing systems given in what is known as cuneiform. Cuneiform gets its name from the characteristic wedge form indentations written in clay that would undergo considerable modifications and developments as time went on. Further events we could draw upon here from our sleeve include the development of hieroglyphs by the Egyptians as a counter to cuneiform, and by the way, the Egyptians had a monopoly on papyrus, so that certainly helped their empire of writing. The establishment of the first empire in history seen by the Akkadian Empire, the construction of elaborate structures most famously seen by Stonehenge, some of the first legal systems as given by the Code of Hammurabi, and finally, last but not least, the Bronze Age collapse, often dated to the year of 1177 BC. The collapse is especially interesting as it goes against the conventional understanding of human civilizations, making steady linear progress over time, where further developments are gradually developed by mimicking other civilizations. What we instead witness is very much the notion of ideas being independently discovered and developed in different regions around the historical map. The notion of a civilizational collapse is also relevant in the sense of disintegration of empires, economic collapse, as well as an urban abandonment, which obviously had catastrophic consequences. Oh, and to this last point, there's a great book on the subject, and even a graphic history novel written by Eric Klein if you prefer not to read so much. I will also link a good interview with the author I saw in the description if you're interested. I lastly mention here that this period saw the decline, along with an eventual collapse, of the Mycenaean civilization, which brought Greece into its Dark Ages. Okay, so now with the highlight reel of the Bronze Age quickly done away with, we can begin discussing the Bronze Age in the Aegean context, where we start off with the early Bronze Age from around 3000 to 2000 BC. I guess I should have defined earlier in this video the notion of the Aegean world, which connects the Aegean Sea, located between the Greek mainland, the coast of Turkey, and the islands scattered throughout the area, to different civilizations who inhabited these regions. We may also use the term Aegean civilization, which we use as a general term for Bronze Age civilizations of Greece located around the Aegean Sea. Here for us, the Minoans and the Mycenaeans will take center stage of our exploration into the ancient times surrounding this period. For completeness, we should also mention the Cycladic culture, which arose in the Cyclades Islands located southeast of mainland Greece. While not being classified as a fully fledged civilization, this local culture nonetheless made interesting contributions to art, as well as partaking in a maritime trade, although their settlements, it should be mentioned, were of a much more local scope than seen, for example, by the Mycenaeans and Minoans. Back to the Minoans then, this civilization served as the oldest civilization which entered into the Aegean world, more specifically who inhabited the island of Crete during roughly the start of this period. Being located on an island naturally meant a preoccupation with the sea, and this civilization would develop in many ways as that of a naval empire militarily, while also maintaining a high standard in terms of art and culture. Interestingly, although Greece later on is also very much in association with that of a naval empire, the depictions of Homer compared to the later classical age display Greece as less of a naval empire in terms of colonies and focuses instead more on the land aspect, where Homer represents agriculture as being of prime importance. In relation to the Minoan people and their civilization, naturally these people both sailed and traded with other regions in order to expand their influence and development. One example that comes to mind is with Egypt, for example, where the Minoans would have exploited favorable winds in order to sail their way to the North African coastline. As an example, skilled artisans sailed from the island of Crete to Egypt in order to further influence the art in Egypt by implementing their own technique of fresco making, among others. This is backed up by archaeological findings such as the uncovered Tel el-Daba site located in the Nile Delta, or what was previously known as the Avaris, the capital city of the Hyksos, who served as the kings of the 15th dynasty of Egypt. In any case, there have also been uncovered frescoes at the site of striking similarity to those found on Minoan Crete, which highly suggests that Minoan artisans traveled there at some time point. I should mention here that while the Minoans flourished from around 3000 BC to 1415 BC, our other major civilizational player, the Mycenaeans, came to flourish at a later time from around 1600 BC to 1100 BC, where we will therefore namely start off by discussing the Minoans. Lastly, there is an analogy I made in the previous video in this series relating the Minoans and the Mycenaeans functioning as the parents of later Greeks who emerged from 800 BC and forwards, which I find especially useful here. This could be taken to view the Minoans as the mother civilizational entity, which provided the early cultural DNA establishing factors in terms of an identity along with an impetus on trade, which meant economic development that thus provided an early nurturing envelopment of some sorts for the later Greeks. We may here, for instance, mention the city-state of the wealthy Corinth, which also prospered due to its location where one could tax economic activity in order to expand one's economy. The Mycenaeans, on the other hand, serving as the father brought to instill the heroic legacy in many ways, in terms of reinforcing a warrior's ethos, bringing in a more structured order along with infusing the cultural identity with more heroically epic literature, such as those seen through Homer, political structures, and a strong military orientation that sought to bring an ambitious, expansive role to the later Greeks. So we could say that ancient Greece is very much a hybrid of both its parents, as well as having its own contributions, of course. Now, let's return to the early Bronze Age, which, if we were to travel back in time to, let's say, Crete during this period, it might have been perceived as quite barren in contrast to later periods, where this period marks the time before the more expansive palatial structures were built. There is evidence to suggest that the Minoans were already quite adept with metalworkings, as witnessed in the archaeological record, where we among others find small daggers made from a mix of copper and arsenic, as well as a more cultivated metal ornamentations showing up on grave sites. The differing degrees to which tombs were decorated in terms of wealth already shows signs of a social stratification among its inhabitants. Another natural development during this period was the settlements that arose during this period on Crete. where, as mentioned previously, an important demarcation between a local culture and a fully expansive civilization lies in the complexity, sheer scope, as well as social complexity of given settlements. For Crete, the most developed settlement we have evidence for is the settlement of Knossos, where we later in the Middle Bronze Age get to the ancient Minoan palace of Knossos, where in fact we can date the first Minoan palace of Knossos back to circa 1900 BC. These palatial structures do not only give insight into the technical developments of the Minoans, but perhaps more importantly, they serve as one of the best sources of information relating both the social structure and culture of Bronze Age Crete. There is also, in addition to Knossos, evidence of settlements in places such as Malea and Phaistos. In general, we could say then that the settlements in the early Bronze Age, before the more expansive palaces were built, are of a more modest character to what we later observe. That is not to say that this was not a civilization in growth. For example, in terms of structure, we see the construction of a cluster formation of small villages or hamlets. The houses here were typically constructed of mud bricks or stone, where we don't see large central buildings surrounded by large communal spaces, which again gives some insights into the fact that we are dealing with a less complex social organization than we observe in later times. As time progresses, we see more gradual developments of these structures, which become more complex as we near the Middle Bronze Age period. This is again influenced by the expansion of trade and the wealth accumulation that happens over time, where we may conjecture that we may get to an emergence of social stratification due to the emergence of an elite class, which further influences an increase in centralization that drives a more complex society formation that culminates in many ways with the palatial period. We can see this development structurally as well, where we get an emergence of towns as well as temples, which is obviously also associated with an expansion in the population size, but nonetheless serve in many ways as civilizational leaps when it comes to Minoan culture. Thus, we see an expandatory role being developed by the Minoans during this period, both in regards to technological development, as well as the increasing focus on trade and economic activity. Contrast this to the mainland of Greece during the early Bronze Age, where we see the early emergence of the Mycenaeans, where I should mention here there is still an ongoing debate as to the exact origins of the Mycenaean people, where people theorize that the civilization made its entry from Indo-European migrants dating back to this period, while other researchers conjecture that the date should be pushed back a lot further, making a strong relation to the emergence of an early agricultural age. And we even find historians who argue for as a recent date as 1600 BC. We certainly know that it was around this later time that the Mycenaeans first flourished, but we also have archaeological evidence of complex societies in terms of wealth, which could indicate an earlier origin point. So I feel this is a good place to end the video, where we will delve deeper into the Minoans in the early Bronze Age in the next video, making a dedicated video on the subject, focusing in on economic activity and social developments in particular in more detail. We should also discuss the often overlooked Cyclades of the Aegean archipelago community. Thus, to summarize, we have in this video made a brief overview of the different periods of ancient Greek history, where the classical period takes dominance in history books typically, given a mini introduction to the Bronze Age stating the importance of the material of bronze, as well as discussing the collapse of this age, and lastly looked briefly at both the Minoans and the Mycenaeans as seen through the early Bronze Age, where we can see an increasing number of more advanced settlements. Yeah, and I should say the next video should also be more specialized into just one main area of early Bronze Age, where we in this video obviously jumped around quite a lot, so it's still a continuation in terms of an introduction to this early time period. So yeah, please, if you like this video, give a like, subscribe, and all that good stuff, and I will see you in the next video. Cheers!